So then we are back with more understandings from the time of the Second Tabernacle services, where we find in the Aramaic English translation of the word. This translation comes from the original manuscripts of the prophets of the Israelic lineage. So then we can understand the time of the end as per YershiYAhu the prophet. We find layers of understanding of the spring feast, the autumn feast, and also the returning of the cities of the Messiah laid waste for many centuries. So then, as YershiYAhu has mentioned regarding the Messiah and the promised prophet, we find in the holy cities of the Savior then returning, YershiYAhu chapter 1:8, and then also the 61st chapter of YershiYAhu then explains the spring feast, a section, the first section of the chapter, explains of the completion of this period found in Leviticus the 23rd chapter. And then during this time where nations they are trying to extend the time of the deceit, let's then evaluate what's going on then as far as the northern kingdom. Nations are trying to impose sanctions upon this kingdom, and we understand from the 11th chapter of Daniel what has Daniel taught us as far as the holy instructions are concerned regarding then the restoration period. The analogy is very simple. During the time of the 1,000 years of deceit, nations did what they wanted. If you trace back ever since 1009, you find then the phrase the New World Order. Also, you find in the Bilderberg group those people that used to make important decisions in this world regarding the New World Order. And the term is very simple. No holy cities, then the Messiah would not speak through his tabernacle. Then the world was in uproar. Obviously they would have to have some sort of organization. So then, the word restoration simply means the returning of the holy cities, found then in YershiYAhu chapter 1:8, where then the Gentiles, if you read the prophecy, you try not to do then as far as numbers are concerned, because chapter 1:8 obviously comes before the 61st, but they are not in chronological order. You have to understand times and seasons and the layers related with each of them. That's why then the Greco and the Romans, they made so many mistakes regarding the instructions, because they were simply ignorant. They probably were honest people, but unfortunately they did not have the knowledge to make those translations. And then people, when they read the wrong translations, they make the wrong pictures in their minds, and then they find themselves in crazy situations. The prime example of this is obviously United States. You find the country, unfortunately, going around the world in most special sense than in Asia, the very place where then trade is obviously being refurbished, so then we can read the 62nd chapter of YershiYAhu and find and then the sons of Ishmael then having control over trade, but then via the fuel. As we read then this section, why then the wrong translation makes so many people out of the path? It's very simple, because the flesh, the part of the human being related with desires, of this world, you find then the insatiable desire for control via then the satisfying of the flesh without then the importance of the spirit. How do we find this? Very simply, in Acts, the 2nd chapter, you find then the 40 days related with this teaching was the disciplines of Ruach HaKodesh, or then the path. Maintains oneself, then discipline after the instructions. Then we find the 40 days is the exercise of control. There is no relation with the Messiah only coming back from the dead and then spending 40 days. You won't find this. 40 days would never be enough. The Messiah would never only speaking of words worth of years worth of rehearsals. Those rehearsals are then obviously maintained to this day. Not holy as they should have, but people are reminding themselves of those holy feasts of Leviticus, the 23rd chapter. So then obviously when the Messiah came back, he spent a year with his people. The problem is the translators during the time, the very original translators of the holy instructions, they were ignorant. They didn't understand what those situations meant. So what did they do? They translated part of it, of what was familiar, and then during the time of the shadow prophetic events, they didn't understand what those meant. So they used what they used to do popularly during the time of these translations, such as then the wife of Lot becoming a column of salt, and then other areas they introduced what they knew at the time. You find these, for instance, United States finishing up this huge project on the Ozarks. Where do they get the idea of going underground like reptiles? They are expecting some sort of unrest. But then doing this from behind people's back, it is extremely dangerous. Firstly then, you find at this time United States and Germany coming up together and then smiles around and trying to impose sanctions upon the kingdom of the north. It is absolutely deadly. They should think very cautiously what they are scheming, because it is dangerous. There is the hand of the Creator in the midst of it. They can't circumvent what was recorded. So then, what do we expect from Daniel the 11th chapter? We do understand that there is then the despised nation. We do understand there is a kingdom of the east, north, and south. We understand there is a restoration period, and then the power from governments being distributed amongst the people. So then, as it was explained yesterday, why is it then a Creator decided of having China as a country related with trade, if then Ishmael was then the first as far as the anointing of Ibrahim? You must think for a moment, because this defines what's coming in the future. Obviously you find then, because he wanted the inclusion of the Gentiles in the midst of this trade of the end. Where do we find this? YershiYAhu chapter 1:8. You find the returning of the cities of the Savior and the Gentiles included in the plan. Then you find then the Gentiles taking care of the vineyards and their flocks. What does it mean? You find those who are saved and testifying on behalf of the Messiah being part of this holy plan. Then we are talking of the restoration period and the Gentiles involved. But wait a minute, was it not 37th chapter of Ezekiel related with a couple of sticks of authority of Ishmael and Isaac? How come you have then China not related with the covenant, then having the forward motion of this time? So then not only this, but then you find the United States involved with a huge plan in the center of the country. Where did they get the idea of these 12 gates in the midst of a mountain and then going down like reptiles? They got from the wrong instructions. And then the situation is not trying to cover it up, it's trying to explain what was done. Because the nations, they can't come against the holy instructions. It must be developed in a certain way, this new system, and the system is already uploaded. What do we understand of this system? As you find the power being removed from the hands of governments, not via anarchy, but via an organizational system where then you must include the divine explained via Daniel the prophet on behalf of the Gentiles, and then restoring the authority of Ishmael as the first trader, the first son of Ibrahim. You find then the caravans, for instance, during the time of Joseph, when he was sold into slavery in Egypt. He was sold into the caravan of the Ishmaelites, the sons of Ishmael. They were already doing trade on the land, and they were from the lineage of trade. At this time you find then China not related with Ibrahim taking the forward motion, so then the Gentiles are included, and then later the sons of Ishmael, they are part of it via then petroleum or the crude. Okay, this much people understand. But then, what is then becoming of the despised one? The despised one of Daniel the 11th chapter speaks of United States, trying to extend the time of the deceit, coming up with schemes, going around and then trying to promote state-run areas of trade, control, the state's control over the situation. Whereas you find the contrary must take place. So then the power of governments are distributed in an organizational way, so then governments can earn and the people also can earn. So then, why we must understand this factor? It's very simple. Revelation or Galah gives you the answer very simply. For your merchants were the great of the earth. What is he explaining in Revelation then? Chapter 1:8 gives you then the destruction of Babylon, or the systematic understanding of sin is dealt with. Chapter 1:8 is future yet. When we read chapter 1:8, is obviously prior of the autumn feast found in Leviticus. Now, if you're a person who was never taught having these understanding as far as layers are concerned, then I have to ask the question, by understanding these layers, can you understand the future? Well, that's what the Messiah taught. What he said, not a layer of an understanding of the instructions or the prophets will to be left undone, must be completed. So then, for your merchants were the great men of the earth. So he's explaining of a situation of the past. However, this past is in our future. So then, by doing this, there is a harmony with the 37th chapter of Ezekiel, the couple of sticks of authority. You know, in the eastern part of this world, in Arab nations for instance, you find in the stick where then the shepherd or then the head of the family uses the stick on the right hand as a symbol of authority. We in the West, we don't understand what this means because it's not part of our culture. But over there, where the Messiah was very familiar with, it was the symbol of authority. As we understand the instructions, we must be acquainted with the Eastern culture. Or we don't understand the meaning of these instructions, because then we end up with instructions translated by people who are ignorant, trying to make the instructions of their own. Then they understand a Savior that does not exist. They're coming up with the cities and crazy situations below ground. And the nations then trying to go against the kingdom of the north without understanding the dangers related with this part of the world. Verse 1:4 of the 11th chapter of Daniel. What do we find? In the kingdom of the north later coming with much equipment. The equipment means military equipment. Those are the preparations for the combat of the end. The preparation of this combat, when you find in Revelation, is directly linked with Daniel. Now, if you're never taught in layers, then you don't understand how come you go to this layer to the other layer and then you explain other situation with the other, because the path, the spirit, the path simply indicates. So then, for your merchants were the great men of the earth. Now let me ask you this. The king of Babylon, he had some leverage of making decisions. When first he had then the dream, he had this huge statue that showed up to him while he was resting, and he was very disturbed. He woke up and he was very concerned with it. And it was so concerning, he made a death threat to those people of his if they would not give him not only the interpretation, but they had to say what the dream was. So he was deadly serious. And they couldn't give him the answer. So they had their lives on the line. And Daniel was then reasoning this situation, and he would then, with his friends, they sought the understandings from the divine, and they did understand, so Daniel saved those scoundrels. The woodviners, liars. So then, Daniel explained then what was the dream and the interpretation thereof. Because of these, then the king of Babylon prostrated before Daniel. Now, if you have some news and you go to some president and then the person bows down before you, you would be a bit awkward, wouldn't you? But then later, he then thought of himself that his understandings were not worthy. Then he came to his flesh and he decided to build the entire statue then of gold. Then he made everybody to bow down to his statue. Maybe he felt a bit ridiculous of bowing down before Daniel, and then he turned around. Not only he made a statue of gold, then he made everybody to bow down to his statue of gold. So one extreme to the other. Did it work? No, it didn't. This time of the restoration period, the cities of the Messiah are returning, as per the instructions of the prophet YershiYAhu, and then the nations of the time of the deceit are trying to extend it further. It is precisely the same situation as during the time of Daniel. And Daniel simply, he had to step back and say, go ahead, build your junk. And at the end of it, didn't work. And then he had then found indications of the failure of the king of Babylon. So those people who are then acquainted with a portion of the holy instructions and watching from afar, you find then nations coming together and they don't simply realize. They don't realize. They get together and they smile around and then touch each other and blah blah blah. And then those who are acquainted with the instructions simply, these people are simply ridiculous. These people trying then to place sanctions upon the kingdom of the north. Not this time. As we read from Daniel the 11th chapter, and the kingdom of the north shall do as then they pleases. The government will to do what it takes to come up with then during the time of the combat of the end with much equipment. What can we understand? The most powerful trade of the northern kingdom shall be arms, military weapons. In the early verses of the 11th chapter, you'll find then the netzer of the Gentiles. What does it mean, netzer? It was a word used by Shaliach Shaul. This word was the very key of understanding of the earlier prophecies related with the Messiah regarding then King David. And then the sprout that would come out of the ramification system of the olive plant, sometimes thousands of years later, the plant simply releases a sprout. These understandings then were then related with the Gentiles as far as the system. That's why you find original manuscripts then the netzer, but then it's related with the Gentiles. It's explaining of a system that was already in motion. David was obviously chosen for the kingship, and he had many trials during his life. The same way it would become a time where then a king and a priest from the order of Melchizedek, the first non-Hebrew king and priest of the time. So you'll find a period of time of David, a period earlier from the time of Melchizedek, during the time of Ibrahim. Later the Messiah came, was the promised prophet, and he was then a king as far as his reignship of 1,000 years. So, then you find this system of the Gentiles, speaking of then the Soviet Union being the kingdom of the North, and then later coming up with much equipment. So they must build arms. They have no choice. It doesn't mean it will be only source of income, but the main truly center objective of the Northern Kingdom is coming up with much equipment. So they will be very wealthy via the production of arms. They will rule the military trade of this world. These then gives us then the Eastern Kingdom, starting this new type of trade coming in a very near future. So then those who are responsible can do this trade via computer. And obviously the Southern Kingdom, being also the kingdom of the South, being evolved then with these main nations. Was the most important country in Africa. It is the Congo, because of its mineral riches. Does not mean they are the only place important in Africa. But then we trace back from the time of YershiYAhu chapter 1:8, explaining, woe to the land beyond the rivers of Ethiopia. He's explaining an area very rich of the Southern Kingdom. President of China, Mr. Xi, visited with President of South Africa, Mr. Zuma. They are lining up the details of the BRICS because they are coming to Brazil in July, already indicating a preparation for the time of July. And Brazil already gave the answer of the new system via the submarine cable, 37,000 kilometers under the sea, uniting then Brazil with Portugal. So then the new system of the trade then is absolutely secret. The only problem is it must become then online so every person can do it, because the Gentiles would include it in the plan. Now if you want evidence of these from A to Z without having knowledge of the Eastern culture, without understanding of the holy instructions as far as the real reality of it, and then if you don't have any kind of understanding as far as the layerings of these, plus Leviticus the 23rd chapter, and then if you don't have an understanding of tabernacling, so you can unite trade with tabernacling, first son and the second son. If you don't understand the times and the seasons found then in Hebrews, wrote by Yohanan, you don't understand then the first tabernacle service and the second tabernacle services, then you can make sense out of it. For some people, this kind of a talk is extremely confusing, because their minds were conditioned in a certain way where then the flesh must be satisfied first, then the spirit. For your merchants were the great man of the earth. He's already given you the answer. The merchants. Merchants meaning then the freighters. Obviously you find then the companies related with production, understandably. But then when we read the first chapters of Revelation, where do you find? You find in the third part of the ships being destroyed. This truly is giving you then an increase of trade. Chapter 1:8 of Revelation, recorded by Yohanan when he was in the first holy city on the land of Cush, northern Africa. The place is then Sudan. That's where he was at because of the persecution of the land after the ascension of the Messiah. When the Messiah had left this planet, it was an uproar beyond measure. People were persecuted everywhere during the time when then the Messiah explained these to his people, and they were absolutely everywhere. They had to get away from the land. So then Yohanan was in northern Africa. Because when we speak of the restoration period, then the prophet YershiYAhu has mentioned regarding chapter 1:8 of YershiYAhu. Then as the cities they returned, the first city on the land of Cush, and then the 7 cities of Asia Minor. There is no holy city on the Western world. There is no holy city on the Ozarks. And because of these, then we begin our quest with the merchants. What do we find in merchants? You find in freighters, you find systems of deliveries of trade. Let's understand then this previously. Then you find in the precious types of, then there is a list: iron, marble, scarlet, aromatic fragrances, ivory, and then unguents, frankincense, and then wine, and oil, and fine flour, and wheat, and beasts of burden, and horses, and chariots, and it gives you a very important list. During the time of Yohanan, he was very familiar with this kind of trade. And Yohanan also was aware of the prophecies of Daniel. However, when we read these lists from the original manuscripts, and then we speak of the restoration period, what kind of items you can think of in our time? Can we compare the time of Yohanan with our time as far as quantity and system? No, we can't compare it. Our system is much more faster. The system is much more reliable. The automation, the electronic exchange. But it is giving you an understanding of this system as a whole, and then this time of the restoration period lined up with YershiYAhu chapter 1:8 and Daniel, and then explains, and your merchants were the great men of the earth. In order for these then becoming reality, what must take place? The stained and the molded system of nations of the time of the deceit from 1009 to 2009 must be then reduced. Does not mean eliminated. It means reduced. This printing money festival of many nations must be halted, limited. And people must be responsible. That's why then the Gentiles were included via the system of China. So then, let me say this. Would the nations understand this new trade system via the countries trying to control it? Absolutely not. Otherwise, Yohanan would have mentioned, and then the nations and the authorities of the nations were the great men of the earth. How would then the Arab nations recuperate the authority of trade? Why are the nations then in trouble and trying to extend the time of deceit? It never worked during the time of the 1,000 years, and it won't work this time and ever. The Creator will show His kind of government. Yet during this final time of this age, and there is only roughly 20 years left, via the holy cities of the Messiah, this world will know what is going to be like the government when this earth is then restored. So then, post-autumn feast. _21st chapter of Revelation. And Yohanan then saw new heaven and a new earth, for the former heaven and the former earth had then been destroyed. He speaks of a government, a new government. That's why then you read this section, because it is post-autumn feast. What is the reference? Read YershiYAhu, the 65th and 66th chapter. Now, the Creator is always balanced. In every situation He is involved with, He always explains, He teaches via His people, His prophets. Don't we read in the prophecies where then the Creator Himself does not make a move until He explains via His prophets? Now we must understand what is going on then with the new heaven and the new earth. When this earth, this existing earth, is then burnt, sin is then dealt with, this contamination of this age then is done away with, and He restores this planet. So the word restoration at this time, related with the trade and the holy cities, is not the same as the restoration of this planet. The restoration of this planet is then after this age is destroyed with a shout of sulfur. That's the second death. Then the earth is refurbished, and then comes the holy Jerusalem from heaven, and then it is the new capital of this world. But then this age must understand how the new system must work. So we understand a divine hand working behind the scenes. And the main situation is why then China is leading the world. Now, because later then the Arab nations must be also aligned with it and tabernacling simultaneously along with it, and the Gentiles included in the plan. So then, chapter 1:8. For merchants were the great men of the earth. He's not speaking of a government. During the time of the restoration period related with the refurbishment of the authority of the Ishmaelites, then is restored via Ezekiel the 37th chapter. So then, it was said yesterday, we're going to evaluate then the 62nd chapter of YershiYAhu the prophet. Turbans are used by desert people. It is then a symbol of the Arab nations because they are desert people. However, the Hebrews, they did not use turbans, they used veils. They are from the lineage of Ibrahim, obviously, but then the first son was the son of Ibrahim with a Hagar, a servant he acquired during the time when he was in Egypt. Then they had the first son, and he was nicely treated. There were no stories of having some sort of a problem in the tent of Ibrahim and tensions and so on and so forth. There was a novel made it up. They had the first son, he was nicely treated, and he was a king of trade. Ibrahim then had to fight a war, and he was then victorious in this war, and then via this war he was then granted with many spoils, riches, where then he gave his first son a forward motion via the inheritance Ibrahim left for him. So then he started his trade company. Later on, when he was already an older person, in terms of 40 years old or so, then Ibrahim and Sarai, then they went on. They had to continue on with the pilgrimage. Hagar was left behind with her son. But they were left with much, so then they were able to start up a company, and they became then the first traders, and then the anointing of the Creator was always with him. He was extremely prosperous. Then later Ibrahim and then Sarah, they had then a second son, and the name was Yitzhak. So there were no tensions in the tent of Ibrahim, because there is a huge time distinction from Ishmael, the first son, nicely treated, and the second son. This shows us the importance of the restoration and the authority of these traders, and they will to have their share of this authority as described by then Ezekiel the prophet, and then also the second son. Tabernacle must be restored, and then the authority of the traders, of the first traders, must be restored. These layers are true. You can read from Bereshit until Devarim, and then later on the prophets, and you find the Messiah layering those situations, and he said not a layer of these understandings must be left undone. Each of them must be completed. Now, is it wise, after so many words and layers and these layerings of the holy instructions given, then nations coming together and they're trying to extend and then the time of the deceit? It is simply unwise. In other words, a waste of time, as it was then the building of the Ozarks over there. Then the authorities of U.S. are going underground of some sort, like reptiles, and then trying to govern from below ground. How crazy the situation is. Can you imagine? There is a brand new system via computer coming up, and then United States going underground. It shows you the contrary situation that goes on with the country. We are speaking of infrastructure of ports, airports, and trains. A huge situation regarding the system of freighters and governments and taxes. Work enough for everybody. And then some nations trying to extend the time of the deceit. What is the symbol of the European Union? Is it not a halfway built Tower of Babel? Then it is incredible that Germany and the United States, then they come together and trying to impose obstacles upon then the Northern Kingdom. Is it going to work? No. What's going on then in Ukraine? They voted for it. And then the West and then the European Union, both of them related with a time that does no longer exist, imposing areas where they voted on behalf of it. It's already indicating a restructuring of the Northern Kingdom so they can build arms. So then, the next time we're going to study more the 62nd chapter of YershiYAhu the prophet. Along with it, then the merchants of Revelation, and then indicating the understandings of YershiYAhu the prophet. Always we must make mention of YershiYAhu. It's extremely important. YershiYAhu is then the basis of the instructions and the indications of the Gentiles, and then along with it comes Daniel and Revelation. They are directly related. And each of those prophecies must then be completed. So then please stay tuned, much more coming up.